My life suddenly and sharply turned when I was 14. When my mother chose to remarry, she chose a man from a past marriage who had baggage, a 17-year-old son. Just a teenage student trying to fit in, I was suddenly expected to fit into this so-called new family. It would be understated to say that my stepbrother and I did not get along. First, it was the little, insignificant things that set the tone. The ink on the marriage certificate hadn't even dried before stress started seething. He would leave his dirty dishes stacked in the sink as though they would miraculously disappear, and somehow I would be the one listening to his advice on maintaining a clean kitchen. Living with a built-in antagonist, one who stole my shampoo for reasons I would never know, only for me to find him flaunting flawlessly combed hair that smelled suspiciously like my favorite product. What truly ate at me was the attitude of my stepdad. He presented it such that I was the cause of all problems. If something went missing or if a mess needed to be cleaned, I felt the guilt directly descend on me. Mom performed no better either. Desperate to make her new family picture perfect, she polished every conflict and apologized for every mistake my stepbrother made. Mom and my stepdad broke major news. They were having a baby a year into this dysfunctional arrangement. It didn't take long to discover that any voice I had in that house was already muted before I spoke. The scales tipped totally at that point. Suddenly, the whole emphasis turned to getting ready for the new addition. The one area I had set aside for myself, my room, was designated as nursery top real estate. I discovered myself sliding inside the small guest room, barely able to hold my belongings. It was a clear statement about where I stood in the new family order, not only about where I slept. As my half-brother grew older, it became agonizingly evident that he was the golden kid. Spoiled and loved, he turned into the hub of the house. Now, more confident in his safe position, my stepbrother leaned into his entitlement, knowing he could get away with anything. He left college and returned home to wreak havoc with noisy parties and dubious companions around the clock. Every objection I voiced was greeted with a sigh from my mother and a helpless shrug from my stepfather. I began to figure out how to stay clear of the anarchy at home. My haven turned out to be education. Anything that allowed me to avoid coming home until absolutely necessary. I joined groups and stayed late for additional classes. It was survival. It was not youthful revolt. One night, after staying late to work on a group project, I came home to an eerily quiet house. The house seemed like stepping across a minefield, always mindful to avoid starting another dispute or allegation. My attention landed on a note on the refrigerator. Out for dinner. Family meal. One about which I had not heard. The awareness pierced farther than any insult could. Unless they needed someone to blame, I was not even given any thought. The breaking point arrived shortly after my 18th birthday. Despite constant protests from my stepdad about how it would interfere with my studies, I had saved money from a part-time job. One evening, I went home to discover my room wrecked. My stepbrother had hosted a party, and my space was collateral damage. Beer stains on my school project, a broken light, and any last sense of privacy destroyed. I called them out at breakfast the next morning. The reply of my stepdad was icy and contemptuous. Not even looking up from his coffee, he continued, "You should have been more conscientious with your things." Mom sighed normally and mumbled about how families should forgive and go on, but I stopped allowing things to slide. Growing up under that roof felt like living under continual observation. Every action I took was under close inspection, not in a kind, nurturing manner, but rather in a let's catch you slipping up sort of manner. My stepbrother, by now a lounging around expert, received a free pass. I recall one moment clearly, a time when I was working on a major scientific project that meant the world to me. Even my younger half-brother, who was just a toddler, reveled in limitless love that confirmed the family pecking order. Seeking silence, I arranged in the living room only to find a tornado of anarchy. My small brother's screams, my stepbrother's music booming, and my stepdad hovering over me with complaints about me using too much space. I had enough. It was like attempting to create something delicate in a storm. After getting ready, I drove to a friend's place. Warm and friendly always, her parents let me work in their calm dining room. I experienced a mental clarity for the first time in years. the weight of home life momentarily released. Also noted by my friend was that she said, sensing the relief flood over me, "You're always welcome here." That tiny deed felt enormous. It also helped me to see how distorted my reality had grown. Home was not supposed to be the location you ran from. Things were boiling when I turned 18. My part-time employment had evolved into my haven, where I could work, relax, and, above all, not be under constant surveillance by my stepdad. It made little difference whether he said comments like, "You should be concentrating on your studies," each time I left for work. One afternoon, after a shift, I came home to discover my room had been turned upside down. I understood what that truly meant. He disliked my absence to pin things on. While our parents were away, my stepbrother had thrown another of his notorious parties, and my room was ground zero for the anarchy. The next morning, I couldn't hold back. Beer stains leaked into my research papers. A light broke on the floor, and the little bubble of seclusion I had managed to preserve burst as it never had. I called everyone out over a tense breakfast, laying out everything in one breath. My room was wrecked, my belongings destroyed, and there was total disrespect. I gazed at my stepdad, shocked by his total apathetic response. He continued, "You should have been more responsible with your belongings." Mom sighed one of her exhausted sighs and said something about how we all had to hang together and let things pass. But I was done letting things go. Everything I did in those years felt like it was under a microscope, not in a loving manner, but in a waiting to catch you kind. My stepbrother had become into a professional freeloader, almost fixed to the couch. Somehow, no matter how many problems he created, he always managed to get a pass. And my tiny half-brother as well? Though he was young, the way he was treated made it clear who the untouchables were. One instance I worked on a major research project I truly cared about clearly showed this. Knowing my room was too tiny for what I required, I tried to arrange a little office in the living room. But things were anarchy. My small brother was flying around yelling, my stepbrother's music was blasting, and my stepdad was continuously hovering, looking for any way to tell me to move my stuff. Frustrated, I packed up and headed to a friend's house. It felt like I was trying to create something delicate in the middle of a hurricane. "You're occupying too much room." Her folks were gentle and wouldn't mind my distributing my work in their calm dining room. There was eye-opening power in the tranquility and clarity I sensed. I had not recognized just how suppressed I felt at home until now, in a long time. Also noted by my friend was seeing the anxiety leave my face the minute I entered. She said, "You should come here whenever you need to." Though it was a basic offer, it meant everything. It was also the realization that home shouldn't be the place you're yearning to flee from. The concept of leaving began to take form. I started charting my departure, picked up more shifts, and saved whatever dollar I could, and I understood that would not be simple. Mom and my stepdad wouldn't take it well, but I would have reached a point where it made no difference. I quickly needed it, as well as out. The idea of recovering even a tiny bit of freedom would have helped me get through those last months. The day I broke the news, I sat them down in the living room with slightly quivering hands. "I have an apartment," I responded, attempting to keep my voice calm. "I'm moving out." The stillness that followed felt so weighty I could feel it weighing on my chest. The look of my stepdad became stiff first. "You feel at your age ready to live on your own?" He laughed dismissingly. Mom stared between us, her face blank, trapped somewhere between shock and concern. "I am," I said, keeping my eye level. "I save enough here. I need my own place." The debate that broke out was nasty. Words like ungrateful and selfish came at me, and my stepdad even tried to shame me over leaving my little brother. He said, as if that should wipe everything out, "He looks up to you." Still, I stayed ground. This was about saving myself. It was not about deserting them. The next 3 days were a haze of packing and dodging confrontations. Every box I packed seemed like a small triumph, a physical manifestation of the freedom I was recovering. Mom dropped by my room on the last day as I loaded the rest of my belongings. Instead of bracing for yet another confrontation, she helped me pack dishes and fold clothing. We hardly spoke, limited to safe subjects like, "Do you have enough boxes? Take some of the old kitchen stuff." It was as if speaking about anything real would break the delicate ceasefire between us. When I finally closed the door to my new apartment surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the silent hum of an empty space, a rush of emotion slammed over me. Restlessness, empathy, and eagerness. Anxiety is something. I was free even though I was alone, and that was worth everything. The first evenings were difficult. The emptiness too great, the silence too strong. I missed the noise, that of the human presence rather than the debates or conflict. Still, as the days stretched into weeks, I began to discover a routine. I could come and go as I chose, eat as it suited, sleep free from disturbances. Life away from home settled into a pattern like finding a part of me buried for years. Though I had a bad connection with Mom and my stepdad, it was manageable now I wasn't living under their house. I worked, paid my bills, and kept my head down concentrating on college. At last, things were looking good. Life continued, and for a time things were calm. My days were occupied by college courses, and job kept me busy in the nights. Though I was still figuring out what it meant to live on my own, the independence felt truly great. I paid my mother and stepfather few visits. We were still awkward around one another, so part of it was because of that. But generally, I wanted to preserve space. That was simpler. Then, one evening, out of the blue, my mother called. Her voice changed to seem heavier. "Your stepdad has been considering his will," she remarked, as though we were talking about the temperature. "He wants to make sure everything is in order," she said. I didn't know where she was going with this, so I just said, "Okay." There was a long pause, the kind that makes your heart beat faster for no reason. She continued, her words more reluctant now, "But not you. Given they are his biological children, he finds it logical." There it was. The stomach blow I had not seen approaching. Though I was not expecting anything, hearing it laid out so bluntly stung. It was what it meant, not about the money. Mom's tone changed, as if she could feel the sting across the phone. I was the outsider, the one who never really belonged, and this was just the last evidence. Mom's voice stayed steady. "You know, this is just legal stuff. It doesn't change how we feel about you." "Right," I answered, trying not to let the resentment tuck into my words. We hung up after a little more, circling any actual emotions. That evening, I gazed at the ceiling of my dark apartment, feeling that ancient pain of not belonging returning. The days after that were difficult. I thought I had left it behind when I left that house. Still buried, but not forgotten. Trapped between wanting to face my stepdad and wanting to let it go, I went back over the chat in my thoughts. Why then did I ever give any thought? For years I had not felt like a member of that family. This was only confirmation of what I had known all along. I started restricting visits to birthdays and holidays when it was inevitable. I started pulling back even more. It was simpler than running the continual reminder that I was always only one step outside their circle. Still, the actual wake-up call arrived on a modest, unassuming occasion. Working on a term assignment in a coffee shop, I heard a group at the next table giggling and relating family anecdotes. Normal, laid back, the kind of banter I had never experienced. It struck me harder than I had anticipated. Neither did I ever truly have nor now have, not with Mom and my stepdad, not even with my half-brother. The awareness was acute, but it also cleansed something from my head. Having suffered over not being included in a will when I had never been included in the family to start with, was wasting too much energy. It was about wanting to be appreciated by people meant to look after, not about the money. I chose then to change my emphasis. I stopped searching for it there if they failed to provide what I wanted. I leaned into the relationships that did make me feel important. Friends who had evolved into family, teachers who saw me, colleagues who valued me for exactly what I was. I gave those contacts my time, and gradually the hurt began to heal. The real test came when my stepdad's health scare passed and life at their house returned to normal. It wasn't gone, not totally, but it didn't control me anymore. One evening, Mom called inviting me to a family dinner to celebrate. Knowing it wouldn't be easy, I consented out of responsibility, hoping it wouldn't be as horrible as I anticipated. The evening was exactly what I expected, awkward and full of reminders that I was the odd one out. My half-brother's academic successes were commended, my stepdad proudly discussed his rehabilitation, and my stepbrother boasted about finding a new job. Feeling like a guest at someone else's party, I sat there quietly picking at my food. Still, this time it wounded less deeply. I departed early, making an excuse about an early class the next day, and came to grips with my place in their world. Not where I wanted to be. I sensed the weight release from my shoulders as I drove home. I felt fine being the outsider for the first time. Beyond that house, I had created my life. After that supper, I kept my distance from my mom and stepdad, adhering to the sporadic phone or visit when absolutely required. It was real, not what I had imagined growing up. The sting of being excluded from their world began to dissipate as my life fell into a familiar pattern. My days were occupied by college, work, and the pals who considered my actual family. Though it wasn't ideal, it was sufficient. Then, suddenly, life chose to curveball me. I answered a call one afternoon from a number I did not know. I usually let it go to voicemail, but something caught my attention. On the other end, the voice identified herself as a lawyer, official, and almost contrite. "I'm phoning about the estate of your great-aunt, your father's aunt." The name sounded far away. I hardly recognized her, an elderly relative I had seen a few times when a child. Among those relatives that showed up in family histories, she was one who lacked actual significance in my life. The attorney said, "I'm sorry to tell you she passed away recently," his voice softening. "And she left her estate to you." I nearly dropped the phone. "For me?" Not convinced I had heard him right, I questioned. "Yes," he said. It took me some time to understand what he was saying, since she left a sizable estate with a trust fund worth roughly $3 million. Though I hardly knew this woman, here I was, picking up a fortune that would change my life. As he described the next actions, setting up appointments to sign paperwork and complete the transfer, I sat in startled quiet. My head was a whirl of uncertainty and incredulity by the time I hung up. The next days were a fog of paperwork and meetings. My great-aunt had left behind not only money, but also property and assets, and I discovered she had been a clever investor. Among her personal items was a note she had addressed to me. She said in it that she respected my independence and tenacity, qualities she identified in herself. It was touching in a way I never would have predicted. She hardly knew me, but she saw something worth tending to. I changed right away with this unanticipated gift. I purchased a small house, a place I could call my own, where I was free from answering questions from anyone. It seemed strange moving boxes into a place I owned instead of a little apartment or house under someone else's control. Along with setting up long-term savings and investments with a financial advisor, I also bought a rental house. Knowing this was a rare chance to ensure my future, I wanted to be wise about it. Initially, I kept the news of the inheritance to myself. Especially my mom and stepdad, it was too delicate and private to share with just anybody. But secrets have a way of leaking, and soon the family gossip was covered with news. Mom called first, her voice gently veiled with excitement. My cousin, always fast with the news, let it slip, and before I knew it, calls and messages were lighting up my phone. "I heard about your great-aunt's estate," she continued, striving to seem casual. "That's amazing, honey." "Yeah, it was unexpected," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Then came the real reason she called. At first, she treaded carefully around it, noting how hard things had been lately, my stepdad's shortened work hours, the growing cost of my half-brother's school tuition. The subdued cues soon became into direct questions. At last, she added, "I was thinking maybe you might help out a bit, just till things steadied." My chest contracted. The same woman who had earlier told me I wasn't part of the family when it really counted was now requesting a piece of my windfall. I drew in a long breath, silence on the other end, the sort that stretches too long and says too much. "Mom, I'm sorry you're going through a bad time, but I need to use this to create my future," she said, her voice suddenly colder. "I see. I hope you're thinking about what family means." The calls did not stop there. Reaching out, my stepdad framed it as a responsibility I ought to give some thought. "Try to guilt me. You know we've always treated you like one of our own." "Funny you'd say that now," my voice steady. I could not help but remember all the times he had stared right through me, sparing his praise and attention for my stepbrother and half-brother. "When you made your will, I wasn't one of your own then." The conversation ended on a strained note, with me holding my ground and he calling me selfish. The consequences were quick. I was not going to allow them make me feel bad for creating a life they would never have been interested in supporting. Mom and my stepdad began telling the broader family I was selfish and reluctant to be of assistance in trying circumstances. Relatives I hadn't seen in years suddenly had ideas on what I ought to spend my money on. Loans and help flooded in, and when I turned them down, the guilt trip started. Something in me had changed, though. I was no longer the frantic adolescent seeking their acceptance or fearing their displeasure. I was standing solid this time. I was done allowing other people decide what I did. This was my life, my future. My choice to hang on to my inheritance set off strong reactions. The calls that began as subtly expressed needs soon became straight accusations. Usually, juggling guilt with persuasion, my mother called one evening. "I simply don't understand why you're being so selfish," she added, her voice clearly pained. "Selfish?" I echoed, shocked. I have spent my entire life bending to be part of a family that never saw me as one of their own, to make everyone else comfortable. Right now, I have something that is rightfully mine. She sat silent for a minute, the weight of years separating us hovering thick in the air, something I could create a future with. She tried again. "You know, it's not just about the money," but we both knew it was. The calls from my stepdad were worse. He was direct, almost hostile, as though my denial of what I had been given amounted to a personal betrayal. "You know the education expenses of your half-brother are mounting. One night, with your tone as crisp as ever, you could help to simplify things." I felt a flutter of the old anxiety, the habit of folding beneath the strain of your voice. I put it down, though. My voice was calm. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that," I said. "It's not just about you," he said, the sharpness in his voice biting deep. "You're part of this family." I stopped, memories pouring back. The many times I had been left out, blamed, ignored. I responded, disconnecting up before he could reply. "Funny how I'm part of the family when you need something." The aftermath was quick and draining. Every time we called, my mother would go from begging to passive-aggressive remarks, until finally the calls became few and more tense. Their stories among the extended family made me seem as frigid and unappreciative, a daughter who had turned her back on her roots. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years felt the need to reach out, tossing in their opinions and subdued digs, reminding me what family actually meant. But there were individuals in my life there for the appropriate reasons. My supporters turned out to be my pals, the ones who had let me into their homes and hearts. They brought back for me who I was outside of my background. Realizing family didn't have to be connected to blood, I started leaning even more into those bonds. It was about loyalty, compassion, and being there without strings attached. The last blow arrived when I received a letter in the mail sent in an official envelope. Claiming that my mom was getting ready to sue me for some piece of my inheritance, it came from some no-name attorney. I sensed the usual shiver of panic starting. As I read them again and again, the words blurring on the page became confusing, trying to get me to court for money, not hers, my own mother. It seemed strange, like I was caught in someone else's dream. I called my attorney, who practically laughed over the letter. He said, throwing the letter away, "This isn't a legitimate threat." They have no legal leg to support them. Relief rushed over me, but it was coupled with a sadness I couldn't shake. You are the legitimate heir, and there is nowhere they could touch what is yours. How had things arrived at this? My own family? Attempting legal threat strong-arm control? When the bogus lawsuit passed, the quiet from my mom and stepdad was deafening. It was the last line I never considered they would cross. The calls came to a standstill, the books shriveled. Though at what cost? It seemed as though they had at last realized I would not move. I understood I had lost whatever thin, delicate link I had still had with them. It felt mixed, relief blended with the finality of it all. I turned inward in the next weeks. I gave my all to work, classes, and the connection supporting me. I began volunteering as well, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time or emotional capacity for. Helping others on my own terms healed in a way I had not anticipated. It reminded me that I could offer without draining me and gave me direction. Then, something unanticipated occurred. One day, I got a clumsy handwritten note in the mail. From my half-brother, who was just 14 years old, "I apologize for asking for money," it said. "I miss you." The handwriting of a little child attempting to close a gap he did not completely grasp was basic and sloppy. Though hardly much, it was something. We began sporadically texting here, little talks about hobbies and education. Though it was not a great reconciliation, I came to see that I could not influence how my stepdad or mother prioritized the people in their life or view me. I could change how I let it to influence me. Looking back, the inheritance turned out to be more than just financial security. I set boundaries, safeguarded my serenity, and continued investing in the connections that enhanced rather than subtracting from my life. It was an exam of my character, my desired self, and the kind of people I wanted around. Though it was difficult, ugly, and hurtful, it helped me realize that love, respect, and mutual care define family more so than blood or obligation. And for the first time, I thought I was at last at a place where I could create that type of family for me.